Our mission is to educate, enshrine, and preserve the extraordinary legacy of Harlem as an influential incubator that was vital to the intellectual, cultural, social, and political advancements of the Harlem community, as well as the African diaspora. Our vision ensures that the post-gentrification community of Harlem and beyond will honor and find a meaningful connection to the legacy of African American achievement and its paramount importance to the world. While We Are Still Here was founded in 2015 to ensure that various aspects of Harlem's history are codified and remembered in a positive way. And I am pleased to present today Decades of Resistance in Harlem, from New Negro militancy to the Young Lords. And our guests today are Johanna Fernandez and Elizabeth Yeampierre. Johanna Fernandez teaches 20th century U.S. history and the history of social movements at Baruch College. Her recent research in litigation has unearthed an arsenal of primary documents now available to scholars and members of the public. Her Freedom of Information lawsuit against the NYPD led to the recovery of the lost Handshoe files, the largest repository of police surveillance records in the country, namely over 1 million surveillance files of New Yorkers compiled by the NYPD between 1954 and 1972, including those of Malcolm X. She is the editor of Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu-Jamal. With Mumia, she co-edited a special issue of the journal Socialism and Democracy titled The Roots of Mass Incarceration in the U.S., Locking Up Black Dissidents and Punishing the Poor. Professor Fernandez is the writer and producer of the film Justice on Trial, The Case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. She directed and co-curated Presente, The Young Lords in New York, an exhibition in 3 New York City museums cited by the New York Times as one of the year's top 10 best in art. Her mainstream writings have been published internationally, from Al Jazeera to the Huffington Post. She has appeared in a diverse range of print, radio, online, and televised media, including NPR, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Democracy Now! And I would like to add that Professor Hernandez is one of those scholar activists who is actually speaking to us from a demonstration that she'll talk a little bit more about. And she is the recipient of a Bachelor of Art in Literature and American Civilization from Brown University and a PhD in U.S. History from Columbia University. Elizabeth Yeampierre is an internationally recognized Puerto Rican attorney of African and Indigenous ancestry and environmental climate justice leader who is the executive director of Uprose, Brooklyn's oldest Puerto Rican community-based organization. She is also the co-chair of a national alliance called Climate Justice Alliance and the co-founder of #OurPowerPRNYC. Her award-winning vision for an intergenerational, multicultural, and community-led organization is the driving force behind Uprose. She is a longtime advocate and trailblazer for community organizing around just, sustainable development, environmental justice, and community-led climate adaptation and community resiliency in Sunset Park. In addition to that, she was recognized in 2015 by Vogue magazine as a climate warrior and one of the 13 women on the front line fighting against climate change. Ms. Yeampierre has been a featured speaker at local, national, and international forums, including Sage Paris 2015, 2016 GRI Amsterdam, White House Forum on Environmental Justice, Yale, Harvard, Cooper Union, Columbia, and universities, colleges, and conferences all over the country. She spoke at the opening climate rally for Pope Francis at the National Mall, The Battle for Paradise at Cooper Union with Naomi Klein. Her work is featured in several books, in addition being featured in Latina Magazine, Vogue, Vanity Fair, The Guardian, Grist, American Prospect, Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, and Democracy Now! Ms. Yeampierre was part of the People's Climate March mobilization leadership, a march of more than 400,000 people across New York City. She played a major role in ensuring the front line was made up of young people of color and successfully proposed the adoption of Nehemiah's principles for democratic organizing. She was recently featured in the New York Times as a visionary paving the path to climate justice. In 2018, she was awarded the Frederick Douglass Abolitionist Award. She recently was named by Apolitical as a Climate 100, the world's most influential people in climate policy. And I would like to welcome Ms. Yeampierre and Professor Hernandez.
I am so excited to be in this space with you. It is really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I know that you were just speaking to Mumia, and before we get into the conversation, it would be great if you could give the public an update on how he's doing. I know that he just had surgery. If you could share that with us, that'd be great. This is my moment where I get to be a Puerto Rican Oprah. And so I am very excited. I have a bunch of questions. You know, I've got your book right here. I buy it for all the young people who come through our leadership training at Uprose. And so de corazón, if you can just start talking about that experience, Ashe, Mordupue, if we could start with that, that would be awesome. Just tell me about Mumia, and then I will go right into my questions.
Yes, thank you so very much. It's an honor to be interviewed by you and to be in conversation with you. Can you hear me well?
I can. You sound very clear.
Okay, great. So Karen is calling me when Mumia is on the phone. He hasn't called us in a long time. He's mostly been talking to his wife, very brief moments. He called the demonstration in Washington Heights, randomly called me right as we were wrapping up. And he sounds weak. He sounds not like Mumia, but he spoke to the crowd about the legacy of solidarity among Black Americans and Asian people. And he talked about Yuri Kochiyama's loving relationship with Malcolm, which he said it wasn't just a political coming together of a Japanese woman with Malcolm. It was also a heartfelt relationship. And he talked about the fact that Japanese Americans, including her own family, parents and grandparents, were interned during World War II in America for who they were, not for what they did. And I'm quoting him, not for what they did, but for who they were, Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II. He talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and said that that was the first legislation passed by the post-Reconstruction Congress, right? After the Civil War and Reconstruction, this was anti-immigrant legislation that came to frame anti-immigrant legislation in America, including today against people from the African diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean. Anyway, he sounded a little weak, but he's strong, and his memory is sharp. And he said, you know, I send you my love. I send all of you my love. Anyway, I'm a little emotional about it. We almost lost Mumia, but an international movement has saved his life every time.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. When you were talking about it, I was thinking about Yik Wo, how it was the first civil rights case. It was a miscegenation case that involved a Chinese couple. And a lot of people don't know that history, and they don't know the long history of anti-immigration started with the Chinese. And there's a lot that's been lost intentionally. So I'm really happy that you're lifting that, because that's where we find our power. That's where we find our strength and the solidarity with each other. And I think it's important for people to dig deep into that and make sure that in this moment right now, where there are so many threats, that we are working with each other in a way that is fundamentally different than the way that we've been conditioned to. I'm, really honored to have the opportunity to speak with you. I saw you for the first time in the Bronx at that exhibit, and I was like a human Daffy Duck. I was just so excited. I just want to share with you a little bit about me and why this conversation is important, because I grew up in an Orisha family where people of African ancestry came together for bembes. My family, my parents had afros. They wore dashikis. They talked about Black power. They reminded us that Black was beautiful and said that nationality was the creation of colonialism. I was immersed in Pan-Africanism as a little girl, and I was a light-skinned child who felt I wore the skin of the oppressor. But to deny my Blackness was to deny my family, my ancestors, and even Christianity was seen and talked about as a vehicle oppression of our peoples. So I never saw my family march or go to a protest, but they were young. They had not gone to college, but they read a lot. And the Young Lords and the Black Panthers were part of their political education. They were heroes in our house, and they talked about them like they were sent by the ancestors as warriors. And I wanted to be them when I grew up. And so here I am with you, a descendant of resistance who has created this magnus opus for generations, fighting the same fight with the extra threat to our existence, which we call climate change. And it's hard for me to have a conversation with you without talking about all of the similarities that I see between everything that you put in your book, that are the lessons that we've gotten from the Young Lords and what the climate justice movement is going through right now. Because climate change is the angry child of a legacy of extraction of our land, of our labor, of colonialism, of enslavement. And so there is a connection. But those of us who are the front line of the struggle against climate change, the ones who are going to be most impacted, are also the ones who inherited the legacy of the Young Lords. So I'd like you today to share some of how you engaged in this journey, how you started, and what your learnings were through the journey before you even started to write this very important book, which I think is a treatise for young organizers.
Wow. Thank you for those eloquent words that pull so much together, including our ancestry, the religion of African people. It's not even a religion, it's a way of life in which you were raised, which is a beautiful thing. I'm just thinking that quite a number of the women of the Young Lords, thinking of Gloria Rodriguez and Denise Oliver, are in the tradition and have said numerous times that if they were to change anything about the revolutionary process, is to be more aware and more deliberate about spirit in what we do.
Because the faith is rooted in Mother Earth, and its existence in the Caribbean and the Americas was a resistance to colonialism. So it's really powerful. But yeah, my fede fue un Ochun, because Gloria is a hija de Ochun. But thank you for naming that.
So I'm just it's not often that you get to speak to people who bring that into the conversation. So I feel blessed. That was a long question, and I don't even remember the essence of it. But how did I get involved, or where do I come into this? I learned about the Young Lords when I was in college for the first time.
Okay.
And it was my senior year. Wow. And I learned about the Young Lords because a Latino studies professor was hired because of some struggle on campus. And she assigned this reading and from Palante, from the book of photography of the Young Lords. And my heart stopped. Like, how is this possible that these young, fierce revolutionaries who look like me took over a hospital in the Bronx where my family went and where my father almost died during that time. In 1970, my father almost died at Lincoln Hospital. And the Young Lords took over the hospital to amplify the horrific conditions of health under which Black Americans and Puerto Ricans were being treated medically. And my life was transformed. And the Young Lords are the children of migration. They helped their parents settle in this new world in the U.S. mainland, in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. They were the language translators, the language and cultural translators for their parents during this big mass settlements of Puerto Ricans after 1947. And 1947 is a very important year. It's the year of Operation Bootstrap, the U.S. industrialization project of the island of Puerto Rico that displaces more peasants than it is able to absorb. And migration is the escape valve for that mass of humanity. More Puerto Ricans settled in New York after 1947 and during the 60s than Black Americans. And people don't know that. A third of the people of the island of Puerto Rico were driven out by U.S. economic policy after 1947. A third. So that is an experience of trauma, right? To be displaced and migration. I'm not Puerto Rican. My parents are from the Dominican Republic. But when I read The Young Lords, felt like my experience. Like I too am the child of migration, living between two worlds, the world of the United States and then the world of my parents in our little home in the Bronx, which resides in the Dominican Republic. And for Puerto Ricans, it was little Puerto Rico in your house. And then you had, so I really, my own experience is the experience of migration. And what I felt was so fierce about the Young Lords, and is so fierce, is that they gave their generation the tools and the language with which to understand who are we? What is our relationship to our families? What's our relationship to our communities, to the nation, and to the world? And what does U.S. imperialism have to do with it? And what about racism among Puerto Ricans and in Latin America?
So there's a lot that you've said. And let me just unpack it a little bit because I don't want to lose anything that you've just said. And also things made me think about my own lived experience about my grandmother moving to a place called El Fanguito because they had industrialized the agricultural sector in Isabela, and she lost half her children. 7 of her children died from disease and from hunger in El Fanguito, and then came to live in the United States. And so those of us who were born and raised here are what was called excess population. And so we come here and our identity is rooted in Puerto Rico. And then in the book, you're talking about how the Young Lords go back and how they feel and experience rejection. And when we organize on a national level our Power PR in response to Hurricane Maria, and we wanted to create a framework where we would talk about a just recovery in Puerto Rico so that people wouldn't helicopter into Puerto Rico and take advantage of the disaster. I remember coming in and meeting with some white elitist academics who made me feel like other. And my feeling and my remembering what you had written and what I knew to be true about what the experience was of the Young Lords, and thinking, no, I am the descendant of extraction. I'm the descendant excess population, and it is our exodus that made it possible for you to be able to function and to do well, economically in Puerto Rico. And this conversation about liberation is elitist and leftist and white in Puerto Rico often. And so I have a right, I have a say, and you can't shut me down. And there was tension. There were tensions, and I felt like I, as a Puerto Rican born and raised in New York City, had a right to have a say in Puerto Rico, and And had that legacy not been documented by you, had we not understood about what happened to those folks, the young lords, when they went, I think I would have felt guilty and would have felt like marginalized and felt like I didn't have a say. But I felt like I had a very different perspective. I don't know what you're thinking about that, but you talked about that. You also talked about the tools and communication. And I want to get to that in a second after you address this issue of like, what is our role in Puerto Rico as the children of colonialism that ended up here in the United States?
So this is an issue that, of course, oh my God, that this is fascinating that you just dealt with this not too long ago. But this is an issue that the young lords were obsessed with. Like, it was an existential question. Who are we? We were not born on the island. We were born in the United States, but we have Puerto Rico in our hearts. And we're outsiders in the land where we were born. Yeah, I mean, part of what they developed was a theory that that Puerto Rico was a divided nation because of this mass exodus. A third of the people of the island of Puerto Rico, that's a disemboweling of a country. And they wanted to know who they were in relationship to that disemboweling. And they learned that the left in Puerto Rico was very elitist, right? Was disproportionately white, and looked at the migrants who were pushed out of the island as the riffraff.
Yeah.
And I literally quoted from the articles written by Marty Bras, who's the leader of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and how just derogatorily he referred to those other Puerto Ricans who live in the American ghetto, who can't even speak Spanish. And part of what the young lords do is to essentially say, who are we? We are colonized people. We are the people, the downtrodden, right? All of Puerto Rico. The way you're talking about us is the way that empire talks about you.
Yes.
With all of your, erudite speeches and all of your readings. And the reason why the Puerto Rican liberation movement needs us is because the question of women's oppression hasn't been addressed by the Puerto Rican nationalist movement, but also the question of racism and the legacy of slavery and the slaughtering of Native Americans. These are all parts of one puzzle of colonization and oppression. And we are heirs to that history, and we need to amplify it. So I mean, that forms the very last chapter of my of the book, and then I also quoted from another liberal left writer. I can't remember his name now. Who wasn't as denigrating with the young lords, but looked at the young lords and Puerto Ricans in New York as as this, this special, I don't even know what to call it. It's a fetishization of the poor and Puerto Ricans. So it wasn't denigrating, but it was patronizing.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the fact that the islanders really don't know what to do with New Yorkers. But it's the majority of Puerto Ricans live in the U.S. mainland.
So I think you're so on point, and I at some point in my life I cared, and I don't anymore, and I think I have. So just to give you the experience, because I think that there's no way to read your book without your personal experience falling into that book without thinking about your own trajectory and thinking about how these things have landed. So my father dies on the way to Lincoln Hospital because he dies from complications from AIDS, and he was a heroin addict for most of his life, right? And so Lincoln Hospital weighs heavily in my mind. The garbage fight and the fight for lead abatement weighs heavily because we work in the area of environmental justice. And then in Puerto Rico, when we go after Hurricane Maria, I go in to speak at the University of Puerto Rico with Naomi Klein and 4 other Puerto Rican sisters, and there's a press conference, and the press only wants to speak to Naomi. And I raised my hand and I said, look, you don't have to speak to me, but you need to talk to these Puerto Rican women who are here, who are holding it down, who have endured the consequences of Hurricane Maria, the austerity, the neglect, and they wanted to defer to her. And it wasn't just that the press was deferring to her, but the academics were deferring to her as well. And I was not. And I was not because I felt that she was documenting our experience, but we were living that experience. And so I'm part of a movement that doesn't defer to white folks, to white supremacy. I'm part of a movement that believes that Black, Indigenous, people of color lead, and that white allies play a role of being allies. So I watched all that and I thought, wow, this is a different level of colonialism. It is internalized. It is in the DNA. And so coming from New York City, where we grew up in the Black community, where these are our people, these are the people who shared bread with us and took our backs, showed us tremendous amount of love, I think we communicate really differently than the folks on the island. And I could see the cultural divide when I was there. So all of this that you're talking to me about feels very, very personal because while I just recognize, okay, maybe I'm different because I was born and raised in New York City, and that's okay, but that doesn't diminish my Puerto Ricanness. You know what I mean? So, but this is the stuff that they've done to us.
The Young Lords called it colonized mentality.
Okay.
Right? They were reading Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, the Martinican revolutionary who fought in the Algerian Revolution, who wrote all of these books. And this is what the Young Lords, but also the Black Panthers and other activists were reading about the impact of the colonizer project on the psyche of the colonized subject and the ways in which our sense of humanity and sense of self is degraded, right? Dehumanized.
Right.
And part of the struggle against racism and white supremacy and colonial rule is to liberate your mind, literally, and stop looking to the colonizer for direction and for analysis, because there's no better analysis than that of the oppressed, right? That's living through the process. So I want to just say that as I was listening to you, I remembered that the flag, the Puerto Rican flag was waving the flag became illegal in Puerto Rico in the 1920s and 30s. And it was New Yorkers who popularized and brought back the flag. Right, because the colonizer is going to strip in order to retain power. There are structures of oppression, right, that are studied by colonizers. For example, the Zionists in Israel studied the U.S. colonization project against Puerto Ricans and Native Americans, and there are structures of settler colonial domination. One of them is the stripping down of culture, language, but its symbols, the control of education, of course, the massive displacement of people from their lands, and so on. And so it was illegal in Puerto Rico to fly the flag because the flag was associated with Puerto Rican liberation, but also with a whole series of songs tied to the flag. And it wasn't until the 1960s that Puerto Ricans in New York decided to break with the taboo of the flag. And so Puerto Ricans in New York can be credited with bringing back the Puerto Rican flag to the culture of the island and New York. Like, if you think about New York, you think of the Puerto Rican parade.
Yep.
And the flag, which is everywhere.
Everywhere.
New York is
in our cars, in our windows, en la esquina.
New York culture is synonymous with the Puerto Rican flag, more so than any flag, it seems, because of the impact of Puerto Ricans on the culture of the city.
But it is that little flag is our act of defiance. That's our way of saying that we're still here, that you will not erase us. I want to ask you a question before we go to Q&A, and I could talk to you forever. I feel like the time is flying.
I know, oh my God.
You mentioned tools and communication. And the Young Lords did something really brilliant. Remember, there was no internet, there was no social media, right? And so you see a couple like the people, like my family, knowing everything about the Young Lords, really understanding their political frameworks. They were really effective in taking really complex ideas that were rooted in Frantz Fanon and all of these readings that they were doing and making them accessible to the public. Today's generation is having a very difficult time, even though they have access to all those tools. They come up with insular language like defund the police, and Doña Julia on the corner doesn't know what that means. And so while we understand and lift the intention behind defund the police, the bottom line is that if we are concerned about base building, about transformation, about making sure that our people own these concepts, we are failing if they don't understand what defund the police means, because we're using language that is insular, that is really just a generation talking to each other. But the Young Lords are really good at that. And they did it at a time when we had none of these tools. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because I know that's covered throughout your book, so that you can share it with the public about how we can be more effective as movement builders in using language that doesn't exclude, that doesn't come across as being elitist, and that makes it possible for people to see their narrative in that language.
Well, the Young Lords were working class and poor kids from East Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn, so they were of the community. And they had a radio program on WBAI, which they called Palante. They had a bilingual newspaper, which they sold in the streets every day. And they theorized racial oppression as it emerged differently under Spanish colonial rule in Puerto Rico and Latin America, as opposed to the kind of race ideology that emerges here in the United States under British imperial rule, right? So part of what the Young Lords do, among other things, is that they make public a conversation about race that's taboo among Puerto Ricans. They bring it out of the shadows and hushed whispers like esa negra, ese prieto, ese molleto into the public. What is this that we're talking about?
Right.
This anti-black sentiment and racism. Where does it come from? And what does it have to do with the history of colonization in Puerto Rico and in Latin America under Spanish colonial rule, where the logic of Spanish colonial rule was blanqueamiento, the whitening movement, that a drop of white blood brings you closer to the white ideal, as opposed to what emerges in the United States, that a drop of black blood makes you black, right? So they're just really good about talking about these very complex historical processes in ways that are accessible, because ultimately they were connected to the grassroots. They grounded themselves in community. So they were not just on Twitter, right? They were not just in the media. They thought that media is a tool to amplify the stories of Doña Julia, the stories of the oppressed and downtrodden. And the Young Lords were just very good at storytelling, right? Because ultimately, that's That's how humanity has learned since human beings were around. Storytelling. That simple, storytelling. And they told their own history and their own story, and ultimately they sought to understand root causes of social problems.
Yes.
So they were into reading too. Like the Young Lords mandated reading. Reading was mandatory every day for an hour. And they were reading Frantz Fanon. They were reading Don Pedro Albizu Campos, who's the father of Puerto Rican nationalism. They were reading Marx and Lenin and everything that came their way. But ultimately, because they were connected to the grassroots and to the community and to the most downtrodden, and because they themselves were the downtrodden, there was no elitism. There was no, pretending that, through language that we're
Right.
better.
I like that use of words because it does feel sometimes like people are posers, and I feel as an organizer that we need to be anchored in community. That is where we need to be, regardless of what we're reading. That we need to be anchored in community. So I like that. It was really authentic. What you're talking about is authenticity. So I think right now I'm looking at the chat, and I think that there may be some questions for you. I don't know how they're going to be raised, or if Karen is the person saying them, or do I read them? Karen, if you want to come on. But I feel like we need to have a longer conversation at some point, and I would look forward to that. So, de corazón, gracias. My son told me when he was little that Spanish was the language of another colonizer, another slaver. Did I want him to speak both? And I realized that I had kept him on the left side of utero, and so this idea of that Spanish background and what that means, that we are. And also learning that our nationality is a creation of colonialism, and that we're the same people who came through the mid-Atlantic trade. So that comes out when you speak, and I really deeply appreciate that kind of foundation for our unity is what is going to make it possible for us to win these fights that are ahead of us, and they're very similar than the ones in the past. So, Karen, you're in.
I have a question. There's a person on the call. We can't see her in this interface, but her name is Cleo Silvers, and she had the distinction of being in the Lords and the Panthers. And I would like to ask Johanna, how did the Lords and the Panthers work together?
Well, I wish that Cleo Silvers would speak. First of all, the Young Lords are the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. They were anchored in community in places like Lincoln Hospital, where Cleo Silvers was a worker and a leader in the struggles that led to the creation of the first known patient Bill of Rights. So Young Lords drafted alongside of hospital workers and doctors and nurses and medical technicians, including Cleo Silvers, the first known patient Bill of Rights, which outlined that there's a thing called medical discrimination, that we have a right to free healthcare that's disconnected from profit, and that we have a right to a translator, to be told by our doctors what's wrong, and for us to be partners in our care. The Young Lords are incredible because something like 30% of the organization was composed of Black Americans.
It was
non Latino Black people, right? Black Americans from the South and from this country. Cleo Silvers was one of them. And another 7 to 10% of the organization was composed of non-Puerto Rican Latinos. So the Young Lords was one of the most ethnically and racially diverse organization of the 60s, something that people don't know. Organized around solidarity among the oppressed. When the Black Panthers were repressed and arrested on a mass scale here in 1969, 68, with the Panther 21 case, the police essentially attempted to entrap the Black Panther Party and arrested 21 of its members, they asked the Black Panthers to for the Young Lords to take Cleo Silvers as one of its members and leaders. So that's what it looked like. Black Americans and Puerto Ricans had a very, very intimate, loving relationship. Our struggle is their struggle. We're in the same struggle together. And what's fascinating about the Puerto Rican migration is that it migrated into the civil rights and Black Power movement. So Puerto Ricans, unlike other migrants from Latin America, were hugely transformed by the Black Power movement, their consciousness. So there are, for example, white Puerto Ricans who think of themselves as Black because of that experience of migration during this era. And you have Black Dominicans who don't think of themselves as Black, right? So the consciousness, the political consciousness of Puerto Ricans is a product of having migrated alongside of Black Americans on a mass scale at the same time in this post-war period. And they settled in the same neighborhood. So East Harlem was 30% Black American, 30% Puerto Rican, and 30% Italian American. So people were living together, and the Young Lords organized around issues of lead poisoning, the garbage, sanitation, the crisis of care at Lincoln Hospital, police brutality. So all of that keeps you honest, right? And you're doing the work at the local level. This is not like fancy stuff. This is the real day in and day out struggles of our people that is the best recipe against posing.
Can I ask a question? So those issues still exist, but what you find between groups is a lot of oppression Olympics, a lot of competition and jockeying for leadership and to take ownership. What was fundamentally different was that intimate relationship between the Black community and the Puerto Rican community, where it's true that was grounded in love. That's how I grew up. I grew up in a Black community, and us seeing them as our people. They just spoke a different language. We thought they were our people, but they just spoke a different language of the colonizer. What do you think was different? What more do you think was different? Because I think that's what made it possible for us to be able to be united in a way that we don't see that today. We see less collaboration and more competition between groups,
I think that organization is important, right? So it wasn't that there weren't conflicts among Puerto Ricans and Black Americans and anti-Black discrimination and prejudice among our parents or Puerto Rican parents. But what you had was a group that was committed to addressing these issues and challenging them. And of course, this was a moment of revolutionary fervor in the Third World, decolonization movements across Africa and Asia that were establishing a different standard for solidarity and how we understand each other. Like I'm here organizing alongside of others a march because the anti-Asian violence has grown by 1,900% in New York City. There is a history of pitting racially oppressed people against each other in this country, right? So part of what the Young Lords and we are trying to do is to name the enemy. Where is the problem? The problem is U.S. empire. U.S. empire. Right. We didn't invade Asia, and Asia didn't invade us. China didn't invade us, right? All of us, whether we are Asian, from Latin America, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Haitians, people from the Philippines, we've been forced to migrate to the United States as a result of U.S. imperialism in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And what sustains imperialism, what justifies it is white supremacy and the notion that the colonized are inferior. And those ideas migrate to the motherland, right, to the United States. And so the question is, who's the enemy? Just very briefly, the Young Lords work with an organization called Iwer Kun, Chinese revolutionaries in Chinatown, alongside the Black Americans in the Black Panther Party, and people were fighting together for something larger than themselves, to build a world without exploitation, without oppression, so that we stop fighting for crumbs. We're ultimately fighting for crumbs, each other for crumbs. And the question is, can we dream of a different, better world? And you started out, Elizabeth, with a conversation about the environment. That's the ultimate question right now.
It is. It is.
Is this experiment going to survive on Earth?
Right. We're talking about the global majority, the global South, the descendants of extraction, of colonialism, of enslavement. The people least responsible for creating climate change are the ones that are being most impacted. And you saw that happen with Superstorm Sandy, with Hurricane Katrina, with Maria. This is happening all over the world, with the River Niger in Africa that is completely contaminated by U.S. corporations and Western corporations, corporate polluters. And then even this week, as we're doing this fight, we've got all these white environmentalists really sort of claiming credit for 50 years when we're talking about 500 years of resistance. So a lot of the lessons and a lot of the learnings that come out of your book, everything from environmental justice to movement building to even police brutality, a lot of us went into this work because we were fighting for our right to breathe, because we knew that our communities are the ones who have asthma, upper respiratory disease, and we knew our communities would be the ones who would be impacted by COVID. And we're talking about people that are Black and Indigenous who were the most impacted. So that is the most existential threat, and that is the most intersectional movement. It's not like we can choose between fighting against police brutality and climate change. And so that's the climate justice movement. And so the teachings of the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the Brown Berets, the American Indian movement are all part of the framework of the climate justice movement that is led by the front line of the climate crisis. I'm hoping that you'll integrate that into your classroom and into your teachings, because you can't talk about police misconduct, you can't talk about housing or education or immigration without talking about climate. Climate is going to disrupt everything and is going to exacerbate all of the isms that we have been exposed to throughout our entire life. And so it is the human rights movement of the moment. And there is a distinction between climate activists, environmentalists, and those of us that talk about environmental justice and climate justice. We are rooted in racial justice and equity. That is where our frame begins. Those are our core values. And we believe that we speak for ourselves and that it is led by people who come from our communities.
And with that, Elizabeth, I'd like to bring on Cleo Silvers. Cleo was in the Facebook audience, and now Cleo Silvers, who was actually in the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party, is on. And Cleo, please give your commentary in terms of Johanna's book and your history.
I'm so happy. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's amazing. Both Elizabeth and Johanna, I'm very close to both of you. And Karen is my very best friend in the world. So this is amazing. You guys are amazing, and it's fantastic to be doing. Johanna, your book is, I agree with Elizabeth, it is one of the most important books on the history of what we were able to accomplish during that period that has been written ever. And that's why it's getting so much recognition, and your work, of course. And especially your work with the political prisoners and with Mumia. It's all very brilliant, and I can see how it all comes together. I wanted to talk about my relationship to the Puerto Rican community and how close I became. I became a member of the Puerto Rican community. I don't know if the members of the Young Lords remember that I was sent to Puerto Rico to represent the young lords at the celebration of Grito de Lares in 1969, which is where the struggle against slavery, and where slavery was ended in Puerto Rico years before the end of the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States. In my time there, I spent a few months living in Puerto Rico in Lares, up in where priests live, in a unbelievable huge place where they have priests, and it was just above in the mountains, just the town of Lares. So I got to go down to the town and integrate myself into the community. And I even got a nickname, Negrita, was my nickname down there. But what I'm trying to say is that I feel, and I think that many people in South Bronx and in East Harlem and in Harlem felt a relationship that is almost that we were one, and that the struggles that we engaged in were one, and that the recognition of the struggle of the Puerto Rican community became a part of the consciousness of the African American community, and vice versa.
Yes.
And that's such an important thing about the struggle in the United States today, is that we understand and respect each other's culture. The same for Fred Hampton and his work in Chicago with the Brown Berets and the Mexican community as well. And I want to say one thing about the importance of ATRUM, the Health Revolutionary Unity Movement, which was the organization of international leftist organization of workers, healthcare workers in New York City, and an attempt to broaden it throughout the country. We had at the time and the opportunity, and the work of the Think Lincoln Committee, and the demands that we made which were based on the absolute needs of the people in the community. None of the work that we ever did came out of our own heads, just like, well, we're going to decide that the people need this. Every step that we took, every bit of work that we engaged in was based on what people in the community said, this is what our needs are. And that's what made our work so important, and made it have such an impact on society, like the Patient's Bill of Rights, which you can find in every medical facility and hospital in the United States, every hospital room in the United States. The Patient's Bill of Rights, of course, significantly watered down from what we wrote, from our demands, but the core of the respect and dignity of the patient in relationship to the doctor is key. And just one little funny thing that people don't know, and I'm going to be really quiet, is that when you go to the cafeteria in the hospital, and you see the doctors and the patients and the visitors all eating in the cafeteria. This didn't exist before the Young Lords and the struggle of the workers at Lincoln Hospital. We took over the doctor's private dining room and demanded that the doctors include the patients, and that the quality of food that was delivered to the patients and the workers would be the same as the quality of food that was being given to the doctors. And a lot of people don't know that. Those are the kinds of things that there was a tremendous impact we had. The free breakfast program that became a national program in 1981 when what is that guy's name? Ray signed the legislation making free breakfast and free lunch a law in the country, was based on struggle initially of the Black Panther Party, work of the Young Lords, and all of those organizations during that time, demanding that nutrition and the ability to have quality food, decent food for our children was like a key element to their ability to struggle on a playing field, on a level playing field, and to learn in our schools. So I just want to raise those things, because they're so important. Those are the things that people don't realize that we were able to accomplish during that.
Cleo, thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Johanna, do you have any closing comments?
Well, I'm just sitting here honored to be with you incredible women. Karen, the work that you are continuing to do in Harlem to maintain the history of radicals and struggle alive. Cleo, Elizabeth, we are carrying on a tradition, and we got a lot of work to do. And it's just good to be alive and continuing to struggle for a different world amidst people who've dedicated themselves and with such beauty and love and heart. Like, I'm feeling a lot of heart here, and I'm just honored to be part of this tradition that redefines who we are as humanity. Right? Ultimately, that's what it's about.
Yes.
If we don't have any more questions or comments, I guess we can close out today's session. And if you feel like giving, while we are still here, a contribution, you can go to wwsh.nyc. That's wwsh.nyc. We operate on a shoestring, and any contribution you can give would be helpful. And with that, thank you all for attending. Thank you to Cleo Silvers, Elizabeth Yeampierre, and Johanna Fernandez. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Wow. Wow. Qué bendición.